Let me start just by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a German Jew. I was born after the war, and I lived in the Washington Heights section of Manhattan, which some of you may know. It's in northern Manhattan. It's where many of the German Jewish survivors of the war settled. My first language was German. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old. We lived with my grandmother and my uncle who didn't speak English. You could live in Washington Heights and never speak English because it was like living in a European shtetl. The Grünspecht butcher shop and the fish store and the dairy were all German-speaking. The newspaper was the Aufbau, which was a German newspaper. So the Holocaust was really kind of the baffling but still iconic story of my childhood. It was, for me and my brother, a subject of kind of nervous, adult, hushed conversation. The Holocaust was frightening, it was mysterious, it was impossible to grasp, yet it was everywhere. It was the atmosphere. There was a kind of an awkward gracelessness on the part of the adults and a kind of furtiveness on their part that I now recognize as a post-traumatic stress disorder that really everybody suffered after the war. It was the unacknowledged elephant in the living room. It was huge, but it was shrouded. I'm especially compelled, as I've gotten older, I was especially compelled by this notion of rescuers. And both of my books are about rescuers. My nonfiction, Life in a Jar, is about Irena Sendler, a Polish Catholic social worker who organized a network of rescuers to save 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And my historical fiction, Before the Court of Heaven, includes material about the Varian Fry rescue network during wartime France that enabled more than 2,000 anti-Nazi and Jewish refugees to flee Vichy France. Varian Fry is the first American to be recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. Elie Wiesel said, "Who listens to a witness becomes a witness." When I wrote Life in a Jar, and after interviewing Irena Sendler and some of the children that she rescued from the Warsaw Ghetto, I found my mission with regards to the Holocaust as a witness, tasked with telling this story in whatever way that I can. Life in a Jar is nonfiction about Irena Sendler and 3 Kansas girls who rescued Irena's forgotten story. Before the Court of Heaven is fiction inspired and informed by the history of how Germany's Weimar democracy became the Third Reich. This history is compelling and, unfortunately, a cautionary tale for today. As a pediatrician, I immunize against microbial disease. As a writer, I invoke memory as our best immunization against the atrocities humans inflict upon each other. An ethical immunization that fosters respect, love, and justice against the disease of intolerance, hatred, and violence. I'm troubled by what the Spanish writer George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Santayana enjoins us to recognize the echoes of painful history and do what we can to prevent its recurrence. History is cyclical, but we can never anticipate how recurrence will manifest. One thing for sure is it's never identical. I don't think Santayana got it quite right. History doesn't so much repeat as mutate, not unlike a flu virus, and so we are unprepared. This is the 100th anniversary of the flu pandemic of 1918. 50% of the deaths in the flu pandemic were healthy young people. Healthy democracies, such as our 242-year experiment, are not immune to catastrophe. Mark Twain articulated this wisdom in his own inimitable way. He said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And my favorite of all versions of this is from Edward Galeano, a Uruguayan journalist, writer, and a novelist, who said, "History never really says goodbye. History says, see you later." So I gave these handouts so you can kind of follow along and also just sort of take this with you at the end and think about it some more. But this is from a piece in the New York Times about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, by Jochen Bittner, who is a journalist and a New York Times columnist. And it was called The West's Weimar Moment. And he tried to identify the four conditions that cleared the path for the fall of the Weimar democracy and the rise of the Third Reich. I would suggest that, though not identical, these conditions exist again today. Now, I'm a physician, I'm a scientist, I am evidence-based. I do not subscribe to conspiracy theories, but I worry. Today, democracy in all its manifestations is under assault and in retreat around the world. Authoritarian rule is increasingly prevalent and, more disturbing still, acceptable. In Germany in last September, the Alternative for Germany far-right party won 13% of the vote. France, we have Marine Le Pen and the National Front. England, the UK Independence Party, which is now the third biggest party in UK politics. In Hungary, the Fidesz party of Viktor Orban. Austria, the far-right Freedom Party. Greece, the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn Party. Italy's far-right League, which now rules the country. In Russia, Putin is now the Tsar of Russia again. Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In China, President Xi Jinping is now probably more an emperor. And most disturbing of all to me, in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, which has been now demonizing the press and threatening the judiciary and undermining liberal democracy. It's our unfortunate nature to project evil onto others as if we're somehow not capable of doing that ourselves. And I think in considering the history of Nazi Germany and the history of Weimar Germany, we do so at our peril. There was nothing unique or special about the Germans. The Third Reich rose to power as a malignancy within Germany's Weimar democracy that followed World War I. Germany was an enlightened society. They're the nation that brought us Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Bertolt Brecht, Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, but they also brought us Hitler and the Nazis. A plurality of Germans, 44%, voted for the Nazi Party, and Hitler became chancellor in 1933 through legal parliamentary process. The Weimar democracy lasted for 14 years. Hitler was the last chancellor of the Weimar Republic. There had been 13 chancellors and 21 administrations during that unstable time of Weimar democracy. My mother, who grew up in Mainz in Germany, was 16 years old when Hitler came to power in 1933. And she remembers people saying, "Oh, the Nazis, just another government. They won't last 6 months, nothing to be concerned about." One of the decisions that I had to make in writing a historical fiction as opposed to nonfiction is what's the point of view of my character? Okay, my protagonist, Ernst Techow, is a fascist assassin. He's a young Nazi. I decided to use a fixed point of view so that everything that happens in Before the Court of Heaven, we are seeing through the eyes of this young man, Ernst Techow. I wanted to get into the head of a young Nazi and to be with his family, with his friends, with his co-conspirators, and with his community, to understand how it could be that ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary crimes. This is not just one young man's aberration. This is a whole nation's aberration. So we're with Ernst. We see the world through his eyes, from before World War I to the Holocaust and World War II. That fixed point of view also allows for a unique way of looking at the long arc of Ernst's atonement and redemption. In the background of the novel is the Weimar Republic and the gathering storm of Nazism. I did a ton of research to put this book together. It took me 25 years to write, so I think I'm probably the slowest writer in America. But I have scholars of both history and of the Holocaust have at Middlebury College and University of Vermont Center for Holocaust Studies have vetted the historical accuracy of the book. So this history is both compelling and complex. I can only share a slice of it, puzzle pieces that will allow you to more fully appreciate both the hope and the tragedy of Germany's Weimar democracy. The echoes of this history that we hear today have to be understood through the filter of history. We'll see how Hitler works his will legally. He takes advantage of Weimar's vulnerabilities. He articulates ordinary Germans' fears, their rage at being defeated in World War I, their humiliation by the Versailles Treaty. They have been left behind. They've been betrayed by a ruined economy, a degenerate culture, by women making free choices, by communists, by Jews, Slavs, Romani, immigrants. Hitler gives voice to their fear and contempt of the other. He gives credibility to eugenic theories that reinforce biases of Aryan superiority. And in exchange, the German people, ordinary people no different than you or I, give Hitler the reins of a dictatorship that would carry out the Holocaust. The Holocaust really begins with Weimar's tragic failure before a single Jew is murdered. This was the time to act, to resist. Civil passivity allowed the Nazis to flourish. The Weimar period was a period of economic anxiety, of cultural quarrels, of political polarization. Germans hoped and Hitler promised, and these are Hitler's words, to return Germany to its national greatness. Ordinary citizens responded to the appeal of demagogues who used fear, populism, xenophobia, nationalism, bigotry, and scapegoating, and promised that a law and order authoritarian ideology would save Germany from its decline at the hands of the other. Hitler's campaign depended on fear. He utilized inaccurate historical analyses and outright lies to mobilize a vulnerable population. Hitler threatened the judiciary, he demonized the press, he developed a propaganda campaign of savage efficacy. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, was the first person to realize the power of the radio as a propaganda tool. And one of the earliest things that the Nazis did was to provide these very cheap radios for the population. And this was already in 1933 and 1934. They were called Volksempfänger, or people's receivers, and it was like the Twitter of the day. But it wasn't all Hitler. He was necessary, but he was not sufficient for the rise of Nazism. There were at least two additional phenomena. First, that the German people chose Hitler and the Nazis, and that the Weimar democracy itself contained the seeds of its own destruction. And we have to understand this history as an immunization against recurrence. Before the Court of Heaven spans an epoch in Germany from before World War I to revolution and unrest after World War I, to the fragile Weimar democracy, the rise of the Nazis, World War II, and the Holocaust. My title, Before the Court of Heaven, has a double meaning. So let me tell you where this story first came from. It started in 1992 when I attended a Yom Kippur service at Middlebury College, and the rabbi gave the sermon for this Yom Kippur service. Now, Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the Jewish year. It's not a time where you expect to hear about a Nazi assassin. So he gave the sermon about this young man, Ernst Techow, a young fascist assassin, an early Nazi, and his turn from evil and his redemption. So on Yom Kippur, it's a day of atonement. It's a day where one pleads before the court of heaven for forgiveness for sins against God. But sins against our fellow humans must be confessed and atoned person to person. So how does one do that after murdering someone? What does that atonement look like? The redemption that must precede, that is, before the court of heaven. Historians generally, this is a cartoon from an Austrian postcard in 1919, and it sort of illustrates the stab in the back myth. Historians generally agree that Hitler's murderous anti-Semitism emerged, at least in part, as a product of this paranoid explanation for Germany's defeat in World War I, which was that the German army didn't lose the war, it was betrayed by civilians on the home front, the so-called November criminals. November because that's when the armistice was signed. The so-called backstabbers, the treasonous betrayers, are intellectuals, they're politicians, degenerate artists, socialists, communists, Jews. The stab in the back myth, an alternative fact, inspires populist anger, and it's encouraged by the right-wing establishment. So who's the right-wing establishment? These are monarchists who would like to see Kaiser Wilhelm back on the throne. They're the conservative elites and wealthy power brokers, financiers and bankers, military officers, largest state owners, the so-called Junker class in Germany, and those who run large industries, coal, steel, construction. In hindsight, the Versailles Treaty was really the fertilizer for the rise of the Nazis and the Third Reich. The fledgling Weimar democracy struggles with political fragmentation and gridlock among extremes on the left and the right. Here's the man that Ernst Techow helped to murder on June 24th, 1922, Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau. He's the highest-ranking Jew in the Weimar Republic and the target of right-wing anti-Semitic fury. 1922 is already 4 years after the end of World War I, and Germany is a constitutional democracy. Ratenau is an industrialist, he's a philosopher, a writer, a politician, a statesman. He's an assimilated German Jew who describes himself as German first and Jewish last. These are difficult economic times for Germany. There's hyperinflation, there's unemployment, there's anger at the Versailles Treaty and its crushing reparations. The stab in the back myth is the rallying cry of the right wing. Also of importance is how anti-Semitism has changed from before World War I to after World War I. So for more than 1,000 years, anti-Semitism, particularly in Germany, had been religious. A 19th century German might say, we hate the Jews because of their religion. Judaism is an affront to Christianity. Jews killed Jesus. Jews make matzah from the blood of Christian children, the so-called blood libel. In the post-war period, anti-Semitism takes on the added dimension of racial bigotry against Jews as a genetically distinct and inferior race, the so-called Untermensch, or subhumans. So a German after World War I might explain, I hate the Jews because they are genetically inferior. Jews will interbreed and degrade the pure German race. This racism is reinforced by eugenic science, and much of this eugenic science comes from American scientists. The eugenics movement's influence had increased in response to the flood of immigrants coming to the US at the turn of the 20th century. There's a new book out maybe a year ago that's called Hitler's American Model, the US and the Making of Nazi Race Laws. It's by Yale law professor James Whitman, and he posits that Hitler and the Nazis were inspired by US Jim Crow era laws, segregation, miscegenation laws, lynching, and white supremacy, and that for Hitler, the US was in many ways a model for Nazi racial laws. 2 months before Rathenau is assassinated, he does the unthinkable, and this is what led to his assassination. He negotiated a treaty, the Treaty of Rapallo, with Russia that normalized relations with Germany. Right-wing politicians and the right-wing press condemned this treaty, which they viewed as treason. It was a compromise with Russian communist revolutionaries. Their anger and bitterness motivated the fascist assassins who were associated with a secretive murderous organization called Organization Consul, sometimes referred to as the Black Reichswehr. And my protagonist, Ernst Techow, is one of these assassins. And on June 24th, 1922, they killed Ratenau. Crowds mourned Rathenau's death. He was a beloved statesman. Flags are at half-mast. Workers stage mass demonstrations in mourning and protest. A special court is created because this Rathenau's assassination was after a period of about 3 years during which 350 political assassinations were carried out by this underground organization, Consul. And they formed this special court. This is a photograph of the court hearing. This is Ernst Techow, my protagonist. He's defendant number 2. His brother is defendant number 6. Can't quite see him. That's Hans-Gerd Techow, his younger brother, who was also implicated in the co-conspiracy. I felt, when I heard this story as a Yom Kippur sermon, I was really deeply moved and inspired to find out some more information about this. So I started doing some research, and I came across some primary evidence of microfilm transcripts from the National Archives of Ernst Techow's arrest, his interrogation, and the transcripts of this trial. Some of them were handwritten. This is an example of some of that. I sat with a friend of mine, Marita Schein, who is a German woman in Middlebury. We sat every Tuesday in the Ilsley Library, going frame by frame through these transcripts and translating them. This is like finding gold for a writer. I mean, to have my protagonist's actual dialogue, to have actual information about him, about his family, about the co-conspirators in this trial, to make his dialogue be true to who this person actually historically was. I read newspaper accounts and scholarly works of the trial and of Weimar Germany, and this history grew larger and more fantastic. This trial was in all the major newspapers of the world, and in some cases it was front page, and I'm going to read you something about that in a second. It was actually the trial of 13 mostly young fascists and violent nationalists, the early Nazis, whose mission was to destroy the fledgling Weimar democracy. It's really a window on the early tumultuous years of Germany's Weimar Republic, and it reveals the earliest omens and manifestations of Nazism festering within this fragile democracy. Rathenau's elderly mother, Matilda Ratenau, who attends Ernst's trial. She attends this trial. She's sitting there every day except the last day. And before he is sentenced, she asks that her letter to Ernst's mother, this is a letter from Rathenau's mother to Ernst's mother, she asks that it be read aloud in court. This was the headline in the German newspaper the next day. Brief reading, I'm going to read. Dr. Hahn is Ernst's lawyer. For the first time in 2 weeks of proceedings, Frau Rathenau's chair in the gallery was conspicuously empty. Dr. Hahn adjusted his reading glasses. He began, Frau Rathenau addressed this letter to Frau Techow on July 3rd, only 9 days after the assassination. My dear Frau Techow, in grief unspeakable, I give you my hand, you of all women the most pitiable. Say to your son that in the name and spirit of him he has murdered, I forgive, even as God may forgive. If, before an earthly judge, he make a full and frank confession of his guilt, and before a heavenly one repent. Had he known my son, the noblest man earth bore, he would rather have turned the weapon on himself than on him. May these words give peace to your soul, Matilda Ratenau. The silence, as dense as fog on the hovel, was metered by the subtle beat of ceiling fans. A woman coughed in the shadow under the balcony. It seemed a signal for everyone to exhale at once, their breath becoming the rustle of clothes, the clearing of throats, sniffles, white handkerchiefs fluttering. Dr. Hahn folded the letter carefully, then wiped his pince-nez and said, Ernst Techow has confessed the whole truth to his earthly judges, and he will answer before his heavenly judge. I ask the court to pass judgment in the spirit of Frau Rathenau's letter. Ernst looked to the empty chair from which Frau Rathenau had presided over the court as surely as the judges. He resisted her words, but they pried into him like a thief picking the lock of his heart. So Ernst takes this letter to prison with him. He doesn't understand it. He goes to prison as a young fascist assassin, but something happens to him. I want to go back a little further in history because to before World War I, because people are not born murderers, they're not born Nazis, they are taught. And so I want to consider briefly the indoctrination of young people in Germany at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. My main characters, Ernst, Lisa, and Fritz, spend their summers as Wandervogel. That's German for wandering birds. This was a popular German youth movement that dated back to the 19th century. Blood and soil, Blut und Boden. It's a Nazi slogan, ominously resurrected in Charlottesville, Virginia last year. And it expresses the 19th century German idealization of a racially defined national body, the blood, united with a settlement area, the soil of the fatherland. Rural and farm life, German Nordic peasantry are idealized as a counterweight to the nomadism of urban Jewish immigrants. This is specifically racist, it's specifically anti-Semitic. The concept of Lebensraum, of living room, the belief that the German people needed to reclaim historically German areas in Poland, in Ukraine, that this was their historic right. The ethos of these youth movements that incorporated this philosophy was to get back to nature, to freedom, to shake off the restrictions of society, and to celebrate Germany's heroic Teutonic roots. These groups there was a whole spectrum of these youth groups that ranged anywhere from Jewish liberal hippie-like groups to militaristic, nationalistic, and anti-Semitic. Ernst Techow belongs to the latter. What began as an innocent German youth movement, the Wandervogel, became the Hitler Youth. During World War I and after the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Eastern Russian front collapsed. The Russians pulled out of the war. And this was a gift to the Germans. They were able to redouble their effort on the Western Front, and there was a spring offensive that started in March of 1918. The Germans almost won World War I. They came very close. They came within 40 miles of Paris, with this offensive. If it hadn't been for the United States entry into the war in 1917, the outcome might have been very different. By the summer of 1918, the outcome of the war really teetered in the balance, and the Allies beat back the offensive, or started beating back the offensive, and by October of 1918, Germany is on the verge of defeat. So on October 28th, 1918, the German High Command, in a desperate final effort, orders the formidable German fleet to attack the blockading British Navy. The German fleet has been blockaded since 1916 at the Battle of Jutland. And this is a remarkable bit of history, and again, I couldn't have made this up. At this point, Germany is still a monarchy under Kaiser Wilhelm. Ernst Techow is a politically naive 17-year-old cadet naval officer. He is on the battle cruiser Helgoland, which is one of these. This is a battle cruiser. I don't know if this is the Helgoland or not, but that's one of them, at the blockaded Kiel naval base. And Ernst is in charge of the men in the boiler room of the battleship. He gives the order, which came throughout the fleet, that the fleet was going to sail and engage the British fleet. And there is a fleet-wide mutiny. The sailors refuse. And this mutiny is successful. Within 2 weeks, the German war effort collapses. The Kaiser abdicates the throne, and Germany is declared a republic. It surrenders and signs the armistice. But in Germany, there's no peace after the armistice is signed. guy is the Social Democratic minister and deputy leader, Philip Scheidemann. He hears that when this photograph was taken, there are huge crowds gathered outside the Reichstag. This is the exterior of the Reichstag. And the communists have been in revolt from the mutiny that started 2 weeks before that. And Scheidemann hears a rumor that the communists are about to declare Germany a Soviet republic. So to preempt this declaration from the communists, he, in a panic, rushes to this balcony and makes a spontaneous speech to the thousands gathered outside. And he closes with these words: "The old and rotten, the monarchy has collapsed, the new may live, long live the German Republic." He returns to the Reichstag to finish his lunch, and there he meets Chancellor Ebert, who is apoplectic with rage at him. He pounds the table with his fist and he shouts at him for all to hear, "You have no right to proclaim the Republic. What becomes of Germany, a republic, or whatever, that is for the Constituent Assembly to decide." But it's too late. The Republic has been prematurely born, and the German Revolution escalates. Ernst's older brother, Leo, becomes a socialist and joins the mutineers. Within a week of the mutiny, the socialist red flag flies above every naval vessel in the two ports, Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. Revolutionary Sailors Council takes control of the base. 40,000 sailors, soldiers, and dock workers are involved in the mutiny. Word spreads and more join the revolt. This is a map of Germany, of where the soldiers and sailors councils. These are revolutionary councils. Most of them are either socialist or communist, and they're advocating for Germany to become a Soviet republic. Here are the dates when each of these councils formed, and you can see that they are within 2 weeks of the mutiny occurring. That's how fast this revolutionary fervor spread throughout Germany. And you can see where all of these are located. So Germany was ripe for a communist overthrow, for a communist revolution. There are pitched battles in the street now. In the anxiety of the moment, the communist revolution seems poised to really overthrow the government. And the Chancellor, Ebert, makes a fatal, if understandable, misstep. This would be one of those political blunders that's in that first list of 4 criteria. What he does is he forms an alliance with extreme right-wing paramilitary militias, the so-called Freikorps, or Freikorps, to take military action against these revolutionary councils and against the communists. And Ernst joins the Freikorps. This is the New York Times headline on the day after the armistice is signed. And just to give you a sense of what happens in one day in German history. The armistice is signed, end of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists, new chancellor begs for order, ousted Kaiser flees to Holland. I mean, how much more can happen in one day? And the consequences of this are compelling and astounding. More soldiers join the workers. Now these are soldiers who have returned from the war, and they're throwing down their weapons and they're taking up a cause with the mutineers. The German communists call themselves Spartacists, and they take the name from the Roman slave Spartacus, who in 72 BC led a revolt against the Roman state. They're led by, their 2 leaders are Karl Liebknecht and Red Rosa Luxemburg. So during these last 2 months of 1918, there's a standoff between the government and the left-wing revolutionaries. The government's patience starts to wear thin. Ebert orders some of the returning troops to confront these revolutionaries, but the war is lost. The troops are tired, they're dispirited, it's almost Christmas, and many of them refuse to fight, and they disperse. To take their place, Chancellor Ebert unleashes the Freikorps throughout Germany. 50,000 members of this Freikorps army, this army for hire of right-wing, they call themselves freebooters. And some of these are veterans of the Great War. Others, like my protagonist Ernst, are too young to have fought but eager to defend Germany against the communists and the Jews. A photograph of a Free Corps unit in Berlin. A photograph of fighting in Berlin between the Free Corps and the Spartakists. 2 days before Christmas in 1918, some of the mutinous sailors stormed the German government offices, the Chancellery and the Royal Palace. They seized 3 ministers as hostages. Communist rallies filled the streets. There's more violence. Ernst is in the Free Corps unit that Ernst is part of is the Marine Brigade Ehrhardt, which is the most violent and feared Free Corps in Germany. His unit is about to storm the royal stables, which have been seized by the revolutionaries. Ernst doesn't know if his older brother Leo is inside the stables that he's about to attack. And this is the first time that Ernst has ever been in a combat situation. There's an initial artillery assault by the Free Corps, and then a brief truce is called, and then something remarkable happens. A crowd of left-wing demonstrators, mostly women and children, infiltrate the army and Free Corps ranks and begin to convince army soldiers, the Wehrmacht, to throw down their weapons. No one has the stomach to shoot civilians, and the attack is called off. The freebooters retreat, they're humiliated by the demonstrators, and they vow their revenge. The new year, 1919, brings another wave of street fighting, and once again, the left-wing revolutionary Spartakists threaten the defeated and vulnerable German Republic. Their goal, again, to create a Soviet revolutionary state in the image of Soviet Russia. They take to the barricades again. The army is called in. Once again, the army proves unreliable, and defeated soldiers refuse to fight against their brothers. There are huge demonstrations. The masses carry placards and banners pleading with the army troops, Brüder, nicht schießen, brothers, don't shoot. So Germany's new democracy and the leadership has made this sort of devil's bargain with the Free Corps, who are eager to fight those who have betrayed Germany. These Free Corps soldiers, these freebooters, they will become the Nazi stormtroopers and the leaders of the Nazi party. There are pitched street battles between Free Corps soldiers and Spartakists, revolutionaries, and at this period of time has come to the 1 week of this time where the most violent struggles were occurring, fights were occurring, is called Spartacus Week. Spartacus demonstrations began again on January 4th, 1919, and 2 days later, another general strike paralyzed Berlin. Once again, stores and factories closed. Transport and electricity were idled. Karl Liebknecht and the other left-wing leaders decided the time for a Soviet revolution had come. Hundreds of thousands of Berliners surged through the streets, occupying railroad stations and newspapers, and a unit of riflemen wearing baggy pants and half-buttoned coats seized the biggest prize of all, the Brandenburg Gate. They were a ragtag army with berets and old fedoras in place of steel helmets, galoshes and exhausted trench boots marching out of step, rifles held at every angle. Artisans and factory girls marched side by side, waving red flags, chanting slogans and trading insults with the Social Democrats who marched the other way on Wilhelmstrasse. Spartacus Week had begun, and the Free Corps would be tested. So Chancellor Ebert then orders the Free Corps to respond to attack, and Ernst's unit assaults one of the newspaper buildings where the Free Corps hold up, the Vorwärts newspaper building. And the Free Corps is ruthless in their execution of this, and they execute everybody who was in the building, and even after they had surrendered. The January fighting claims more than 1,000 lives in Berlin. The leaders of the uprising, Karl Liebknecht and Red Rosa, are arrested and summarily executed by Free Corps officers. Ernst is a witness to Red Rosa's execution. This is Captain Hermann Ehrhardt. He's the head of Ernst's Free Corps unit. He's the most feared and respected Free Corps commander. After the Free Corps is demobilized, as was required by the terms of the Versailles Treaty, he forms this secret murderous organization, Consul, for which Ernst becomes a driver and an accessory to murder. The unholy alliance of the Weimar politicians and the Free Corps succeeds in suppressing the leftist uprising. They put down this revolution throughout Germany, and the country is mostly pacified by August of 1919, when Germany's new constitution is ratified in the city of Weimar. The reason it's called the Weimar Republic is that Weimar was one of the only cities that the government could control against the communist uprising. So it was secured by Free Corps units. And so it was just really an accident of safety to be able to have this constitution written and adopted in Weimar. This is Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, and it is the poison pill. It is that unique susceptibility within this democracy that allowed for authoritarian rule in an emergency. According to the Constitution, the Chancellor is the head of state who runs the government, but in an emergency, the President has emergency powers from Article 48, under which he becomes the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. As head of the military, the President can bypass the Parliament and rule by decree. This power is misused often between 1930 and 1933, before the rise of Hitler, when the Reichstag is so polarized, so gridlocked, that it cannot govern. So the Versailles Treaty comes into effect in 1920. It limits Germany's army to 100,000 men, and the Free Corps is officially disbanded. Aside from these treaty organizations, the leadership of the Weimar Republic now realizes that the Free Corps could threaten them just as much as the communists could threaten them from the left. So they disbanded it, but it goes underground as this organization, Consul. And many of the Free Corps fighters, the freebooters, these 50,000 freebooters, bury their weapons for use in the future. And they begin this reign of terror between 1919 and 1922. More than 350 people are assassinated for political reasons. But where's Hitler in all this? So after Hitler's service in World War I, he returned to Munich and remained in the army. In July of 1919, he was an intelligence officer, and he was assigned to infiltrate this new German party called the German Workers' Party. And while he was monitoring the activities of the party, he found himself attracted to the message that was being given by the leader, Anton Drexler. It was nationalistic, it was anti-Semitic, it was anti-capitalist, anti-Marxist. Drexler invited him to join the party, and Hitler accepted. He is member number 55 of the German Workers' Party. So this is a small party. In February of 1920, this small German Workers' Party becomes the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And Hitler begins working full-time now. He's discharged from the army and is in the headquarters of this party is in Munich. And Munich is sort of the hotbed of anti-government German nationalists who are determined to crush Marxism and undermine the Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation begins in 1921. June 1921 is when Germany had to start paying reparations, crushing reparations to the Allies. And it resulted very quickly in a hyperinflation, which was actually a boon to the newly born Nazi Party. To give you a sense of the dimension of this hyperinflation, in 1914, 4.2 marks bought $1 US. In 1923, at the height of the inflation, 4.2 trillion marks bought $1 US. So here, these are children playing with worthless marks. This guy has a wheelbarrow full of marks. That's enough to buy a loaf of bread. So it's a difficult time for Germany. There's unemployment, and this is the time period when Ratenau is assassinated. So it's a time of unemployment. There's anger at the Versailles Treaty. The economy is tanking. The mark is worthless. And it's during this period of time that Hitler becomes the absolute leader of the Nazi Party, becomes the party chairman. She starts giving beer hall speeches that are now starting to attract regular audiences. He especially appeals to rural Protestant Germans. Now, if you remember, just keep in mind that Berlin, which was a very unique city, had a population of 4 million. But Germany had a population of 62.5 million. At least 1/3 of that population were rural Protestant Germans who were the target and for Hitler's philosophy. He began speaking at larger halls to thousands. He became adept at using these populist themes, including the use of scapegoats who he blamed for Germany's economic hardships. He carried on particularly about one document called the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, which was a fabricated anti-Semitic text that supposedly described a Jewish conspiracy for global domination. It was first published in Russia in 1903, and it became a critical influence on Hitler's thinking, and many right-wing people took this as gospel truth. The distribution of this protocol was financed by the Nazi Party, and in the United States, Henry Ford printed 500,000 copies of this and circulated it in the United States. If you do a Google search, Protocol of the Elders of Zion, you will find that it has now resurfaced. And many of the alt-right groups are, again, bringing this forged document as a reason for why they do what they do. On the 5th anniversary of the armistice, November 9th, 1923, Hitler attempts a coup in Munich. This is the so-called beer hall putsch. Putsch is the word for coup in German. So along with 2,000 Nazis, they took control of parts of Munich. They arrested the president of Bavaria, the chief of police, forced them to endorse the Nazi objective, which was the overthrow of the Weimar Republic. The army and the police are called, and they put down Hitler's rebellion, and there's a confrontation during which 16 Nazis and 4 policemen are killed. Hitler is walking arm in arm with his political advisor, a guy named Max von Schubner-Richter, who is killed. And I have often wondered if they had only held arms the other way, how history would be different. But so Hitler's arrested, he goes on trial, and he benefits from this disaster because he has, first of all, a 24-day trial, which grants him the attention of the German people and gives him a platform for his nationalist philosophy. He's found guilty of treason. He's sentenced to 5 years in prison. He uses his time in prison to dictate Mein Kampf and is released after only 9 months because of much of the judiciary, or some of the judiciary, was under right-wing control. The final benefit, and perhaps the most profound, was his insight that the path to power was through legitimate means, through legislative means, and rather than revolution or force. So this is 1924. Hitler is still a footnote. He's a transient extremist. He's a crackpot. In the 1924 elections, the Nazis get 3% of the vote. The newspapermen referred to him as a buffoon, as a pathetic dunderhead, as a half-insane rascal. So there's also a cultural dimension to Weimar that encourages the rise of Nazism. In the late 1920s, Germany is the leading center of the avant-garde. It's the birthplace of Expressionism in painting, Kandinsky, Franz Marc, Paul Klee, the atonal music of Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg, the jazz-influenced works of Paul Hindemith and Kurt Weill, experimental films and expressionist films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu bring expressionism to cinema. In 1928 is the premiere of the Threepenny Opera, Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. This is a photograph of the first International Dada Fair, a radical modern art movement. This is a stuffed mannequin dressed in a soldier's uniform with the head of a pig hanging from the ceiling. Dada is an art form of chaos and irrationality. It's of destruction and sacrilege. It's really a reaction to the horrors of World War I and both the post-war economic and moral crisis. It's very weird. It's influenced by Cubism, Picasso and Braque. It's anti-war, it's anti-nationalist, and it's associated with the extreme left. One of the more famous painters of the Dada period was George Grosz, who was a prominent member of the Berlin Dada group and a communist. And he draws biting caricatures of fat businessmen, wounded soldiers, prostitutes, sex crimes, and orgies. The expatriate African-American performer Josephine Baker is an overnight sensation in Berlin's risque cabaret scene. By the way, there is a cabaret scene in Before the Court of Heaven, which I just had the most fun writing, because again, you couldn't make up what happened in the cabarets in Berlin in the 20s. It was crazy time. Josephine Baker was also most famous for her banana costume. She just wore bananas, nothing else. The Nazis, of course, viewed this as degenerate art, product of a degenerate new culture. And their response was partially from a conservative aesthetic, but it was also their determination to use art as a propaganda weapon. And in this regard, they had the support of the Protestant Church, because this was taking a stand against a secular, liberal culture and an excessive culture. So 1924 to 29 are the golden 20s in Germany. The currency has stabilized, the hyperinflation is over, and the German economy thrives. This is not a good environment for Hitler's Nazis. Between the elections of 1924 and 1928, the minuscule Nazi share of the vote declines from 3% to 2.6% of the vote. Hitler is still a footnote. The weight that finally breaks Weimar's back is the 1929 stock market crash and the resulting Great Depression. And Germany suffers more than most any other country in Europe from the financial consequences. Hitler and the Nazis prepare to take advantage of the emergency to gain support. They promised to repudiate the Versailles Treaty, to rescue the economy, to provide jobs, keep immigrants out, to reclaim lost territory in Europe and their colonies in Africa, to purify German culture. Again, Hitler's doing this all legally. He's doing this as an election campaign. The Nazis finish second. In this election, they get 18.3% of the vote, and they're now the second largest party in the Reichstag. The next election is 18 months later, in April of 1932, in the depths of the Depression. 40% of Germans are unemployed. Hitler has now support of industrialists. He runs for president and finishes second with 37% of the vote. So he has doubled his vote in less than 2 years, and now he's a force to be reckoned with. 6 months later, in the November 1932 German federal elections, Hitler and the Nazi Party take more than 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag. There's a crisis in government. No party is able to form a stable government. And finally, the chancellor at the time, Kurt von Schleicher, with the support of the president, von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg was a hero from World War I. He was a doddering old fool and would do anything that anyone told him to do. But they agreed to form a government with Hitler as chancellor. It would later come out that these men considered Hitler to be a buffoon. They thought that they could control and manipulate him, that he would be a tool to further their own ends. So in January of 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor, legally. Now, here is how quickly a democracy becomes a dictatorship. A month after Hitler becomes chancellor, the Reichstag is set afire, maybe by a lone deranged Dutch anarchist or by the Nazis themselves. James Madison, our fourth president, warned, "Tyranny arises on some favorable emergency." The February 27, 1933 Reichstag fire in Berlin was, for Hitler and the Nazis, just such a favorable emergency. Hitler blames the communists, he suspends civil liberties, and begins mass arrests. He uses charges of terrorism as a catalyst for regime change. And in a 2-month period from January to March of 1933, and how the consolidation of this dictatorship began. Concentration camps were established for political prisoners at Hitler's urging and under Article 48. Again, he's acting perfectly legally. He and President von Hindenburg enact the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspends basic rights and civil liberties and allows for detention without trial. The activities of the German Communist Party are suppressed. More than 4,000 people are arrested. 1 week after the fire, the election of March 5th, 1933, the Nazi Party wins 44% of the vote. 3 weeks after this election, Hitler's government brings what's called the Enabling Act to a vote in the newly elected Reichstag, and Hindenburg signs it. This Enabling Act, which officially titled the Law to Remedy the Distress of People and the Reich, gives Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws, even ones that deviate from the Weimar Constitution, without the consent of the Reichstag for 4 years. The Third Reich is born. By the summer of 1934, 1.5 years later, there are hundreds of thousands of Nazi opponents in concentration camps. Ernst, my character, is released from prison in 1930. And though he's conflicted about the Nazis, he works for Goebbels' newspaper. He is a witness to the rise of the Nazis, and his family struggles and accommodates to the fascist takeover in Germany. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is a champion of human rights, a friend of Martin Luther King Jr., said of the Holocaust, "Some are guilty, all are responsible." So how do we manifest our deeper sense of responsibility? Responsibility for every silence, every deferred response? We are all, to some extent, bystanders. Never again is really too facile a response if it's only words. There's a German word, Mitläufer, which I think is more to the point. Mitläufer is fellow traveler, and it refers to those who make accommodations with evil. When I read Holocaust literature, the question, the speculation that becomes my emotional atmosphere is, what would I have done? We hear an echo of Weimar today in our political discourse. No one of us can reverse this disturbing reverberation, but each one of us can do something, no matter how small, to promote decency, tolerance, and respect for all people, to be the civil opposition when tyranny once again raises its ugly head. George Santayana warned us to remember history or repeat it. Some choose to willfully forget or ignore history. Before the court of heaven is one small effort to keep that dark history alive as a cautionary tale for today. It has been said that Nazism and the Holocaust might have been unstoppable, but it should have been unbearable. Where was the hue and cry from public and religious institutions, from citizens, that this was fundamentally wrong and unacceptable? We are confronted by genocide with sickening regularity. Darfur, the Congo, Bosnia, Cambodia, Sudan, Rwanda, Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, the list goes on. Perhaps the best we can hope for is to be active bystanders, upstanders, recognizing our responsibilities, forgiving ourselves for our failures, but indomitably pursuing social justice and righteousness when we can. I urge you to do whatever it is you can, no matter how small, to repair the world, to challenge hatred, intolerance, neglect, aggression, bullying, to advocate for decency. 2,000 years ago, a Hebrew sage, Rabbi Tarfon, said, "It is not for us to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it." It is our charge to answer, "What would I have done?" with, "Here's what I will do." To affirm justice, decency, respect for all people, tolerance, and compassion as the expected norms of community. Because not to do so would invite the repetition of painful history. Because not to do so will be unbearable. Thank you very much for your kind attention.